Okay, so hello and welcome. Thank you for being here today with me. Today is Friday, August the 7th, and this is Backyard Basic Beekeeping, episode number 72. I want to thank you for being here. It is 83 degrees outside. It is 89 degrees in here. Not bad at all, if you ask me. And if you're new, welcome. If you're a returning viewer, thank you for being here and for providing questions that we're going to answer that were submitted through the past week on a variety of different videos on my YouTube channel. If you haven't seen that channel already, please check it out. And being that this is number 72, it can be hard to keep track of the videos that you've seen in this series. So go ahead and click the like button down in the corner there, and that will help you remember which of these you've already seen. If you want to know what we're going to talk about today, please look down in the comment section. No, look down in the video description below and see line item by line item the things that we're going to talk about, and also some helpful links for those of you who are looking for the items that we discuss. So this is the way to be. And of course the observation hive is here. As we know, they swarmed out. There is a new queen in there. She's roaming all over the place. She has not been heavy duty on laying her eggs lately. We do see a lot of pollen coming in, so that's promising. Keep in mind, we're only seeing the face of these 4 deep frames, so there might be eggs being laid in between the frames where we can't see them with the observation hive. They're very calm, and they seem to be centered. They are consuming some of their honey resources because, as you know, based on previous videos, we did come out of a nectar flow. But now we're in that intermediate kind of dearth period. A dearth is just a word that means the environment's not providing a lot of nectar and pollen resources for the bees right now, but we're on the verge of a heavy nectar flow here in the northeastern United States, in the state of Pennsylvania. The nectar flow is going to be goldenrod. We have white clover out there, but it's not enough to sustain the bees. Why? Because these populations have built up for this time of year in particular. So all of the colonies in my apiary, which right now has 20 beehives, they have ramped up their workforce. So there's a lot of foragers out there scouring the countryside looking for resources for the hive because they need to build up going into winter, and that becomes, in this area, our fall nectar flow, and that's going to be our honey harvest coming up near the end of the month. So a lot of the questions we answer today are based around regional issues going on with the environment. We could get a cold snap. That's what happens at night. We get these warm days and they start bringing in nectar and we get all excited and we look at the flow frames and we see them filling up the cells. Get a cold night, the following day we see a bunch of those cells emptied. So don't be in a hurry to take your honey off of your hives during any kind of dearth because the bees are using that. So we've got a lot to talk about today. I think this is not going to be a very long one, so bear with me here. The very first question, Henry Bendick. Such a great video. Thanks for all the info, Fred. I'm considering adding a flow super next year. Now those are two terms, flow and super. If you're brand new to backyard beekeeping, you may not know that there are different hive configurations. And when people say flow super, they're talking about a flow hive, which includes a fairly new frame design that came out that the whole purpose is to allow people to take honey off of their hives without using a lot of extraction equipment. So, and then super, the other term there is, it's a box that's on top of their other boxes, normally where the honey would be. Just like here, if these were lower boxes in a stack, this would be brood, this would be brood, this would be brood and pollen and some honey, and then the super, the honey super, would be the yellow section up there because there's nothing but honey up there. Super, it's extra, it's over. Like a supervisor, something over other things. So anyway, we've explained that. My new colonies are doing well and I added honey supers on the brood boxes on June 24th. They filled up with capped honey in 4 weeks. What's capped honey look like? It's right up here. It's all capped. Cells of honey filled, bees cap it, preserves forever, basically. In 4 weeks, also I added a second super, which is doing well too, but now I'd like to harvest some honey. Can I pull the first super off and drop the second supers down onto the brood box? So what Henry is saying here is he wants to pull off, let's say that was a super full of honey, he wants to pull that super out because it's full of honey And the top super that is partially full of honey wants to bring it down onto here. There's nothing wrong with that, except I want you to be very careful about pulling off, because the brood box where the baby bees are being raised is generally the bottom box, but this time of year it might actually have moved up just a little bit. So what the bees tend to do is they tend to run some of their brood production in a little arc up through the center of those frames. So prior to pulling these apart and condensing that down, do a very careful inspection. And also start your inspection on the outside edge, frame 1. Let's say it's a 10 frame Langstroth box. You have frame 1 all the way up through 10. Start by pulling frame 1. Don't pull one right out of the middle, because I want you to avoid potentially disrupting a brood pattern there. So if this box were full of brood and then they were arched up through the middle, as we pull the frames outboard of that and work our way in, the very first frame that you come across that has any brood in it, stop right there, leave the box alone. We don't want to disrupt the brood pattern. Could we pull that box off? Yeah, you could. But here's what will happen. You disrupted that continuity of brood there. Plus, you pulled a box that had brood and honey in it, so I highly recommend you don't do that if you can avoid it. So a careful inspection from the outside in. If you see any brood, stop your inspection. Or you can keep going. No brood, it's all honey. Then pull the box, and yes, bring that next box down, pull that box out. You're good to go. I highly recommend, if you live in a colder area in the United States, is what I'm referencing here, that you leave that brood box and at least one super of honey on full for the wintertime. That's why I always let them build that stuff up first, because anything could happen. Sudden cold snaps and things like that. So that's the best course of action. And the other question here from the same person is, how do you clear the supers of bees to pull the boxes? As I know, there are many methods. There sure are. So we're going to talk about one of those right now, and you may have heard of a fume board. This is just, these are sold everywhere. I have a bunch of these because this is how I used to, before I had flow hives. I used to put these on the hives right on top of the honey super, whichever one you wanted to empty, and you spray it with a honeybee repellent. It doesn't hurt the bees. They just dislike the smell so bad that with this on, they'll migrate out of that honey super and they'll go down below. If there's brood up there, you're not going to get them to leave. This can be, a bad method. They'll hold their ground if there's brood, so they just won't get out of the box. But if it's all honey, if it's a honey super, then they will eventually migrate out. Slow process. This might take half an hour to an hour. That's why I have a bunch of them. It has a soft fabric interior. Maybe this will show. And that soft fabric interior is what you spray the repellent mixture in there. And because it's a fabric, it has a lot of surface area, it fumes. You don't want to do that on a super hot day, but you want it to be hot enough for it to be activated and to annoy the bees. And then the other thing is, if it's a super cold day, it just doesn't work that well. Because again, we count on this atomizing into the air and making the bees hate it, so they move out. Is there another way? Sure there is. So we'll go on to the next one. I just banged into my light. Anyway, now this is called an escape board. See the hole there? This goes underneath the super that you want to clear. So you have to lift the box off. You have to put the box back on. By the way, there are handles now that you can put on your boxes, which makes lifting them off easier. I should probably put a link in that. But anyway, escape boards. This is probably one of the oldest design escape boards out there. And the bees will go through this hole, and they go down in here. And then once they go through that hole, they go through this little triangular opening, right? It opens at the corner of the triangle. Then they drop down another level, and they go out the second corner of the triangle here. Now here's the thing. We're dealing with the most intelligent insect, the honeybee. It's proven. They can even count to 4. Anyway, and other things, they figure stuff out. Honeybees are considered maze runners, which means they figure out intricate entrances and exits and things like that. So if you leave that second board on, that escape board, you can do it overnight to clear the super, which I highly recommend. And then the next morning, though, you better get out there, and if most of the bees are out, you pull them off and get that thing pulled off and get that escape board pulled away too, because they do a couple of things. One, they figure it out because they're smart and they start going right back in there and right back up into the honey super. The other thing is they'll start to propolize it. Don't ask me how I know. I've got one so propolized and covered with, I should have shown that one because that would have been more interesting, but I wanted to hide the fact that I left it on too long. Those are my two favorite methods, the escape board being the best. And we're going to demonstrate that later this year because I'm doing an experiment that you're going to want to see. So if you haven't subscribed already, you're going to want to subscribe so you don't miss that, because you're almost going to cry. It's going to be that good. It's going to be just amazing. Okay, maybe not, but it'll be cool. That's how you clear the supers, and that's what I recommend. There are new, I think Curacell, the same company that makes the big blue feeders, they also have a plastic escape board that might work good. It's got a bunch of cones on it. So there are other methods. I just don't have that one. I like the wooden escape boards because they're traditional, they're cool, and they work. Next one, Andrew Clark from Stowe, Mass. Good afternoon, Fred. My name is Andy. I live 40 minutes outside of Boston. I used to live in Swampscott, by the way. Not that anybody cares. I wanted to know your input on when to start feeding, and are you a believer in feeding through the winter if they don't have much honey on? What would you feed them? Hopefully, you picked my question. Yes, I picked your question, Andrew. Thanks for sending it in. Here's the thing. As you know, my goal is always bees first. We're backyard beekeepers. We're not commercial beekeepers. We don't have a bottom line to, take care of. So we could take a total loss through the year. Does that make us terrible beekeepers? No, not really. We just haven't pushed them into heavy production. So when it comes to feeding, if you had to, but first things first, always leave them enough honey, especially when it's the first year. If you're starting out with bees, everybody gets excited. They want to show some product from their bees. They want to get some honeycomb out of there. They want to get some honey. May not happen the first year depending on where you live. Now, if you're in an area where things are abundant, like here where I live, a lot of the first year package bees, generate enough, even first year swarms will set up and bring in enough honey to have a surplus. So the goal is 50 pounds of honey in your area, if you're in a cold area. 50 pounds to 100. So how many pounds? How much is that? So if you had one flow super, that would be about 47 pounds if it was full chock-a-block side to side. It's a 10 frame. You also have the option to get an 8 frame, so that would have less honey. And also a deep. And the deep has brood, it has pollen, and it also has some honey stores. So generally, even when you're deep, your bottom frame, the outer frames may still be just honey as well. So they have some of that too. Honey is also an insulator when they go into winter. So all the more reason to leave that in there for them. Now, what if you didn't leave enough? What are we going to do? Well, what happens after the next nectar flow, the one that we're just getting into? At the end of that, we're going to have a surplus of bees. They're going to be really hungry. They're going to go out there, they're going to be foraging. If they can't forage, if they can't bring in new resources, what are they going to do in the hive during late September and into the month of October when they get these cold nights? They're going to all be in here, but they're going to start to already consume their winter resources. So we can thwart that. We can help them out. Backyard beekeepers. Remember, your honey supers are off. Don't do this while your honey supers are on, honey that people might be consuming later. You want that honey to be as pure as possible and dedicated to the floral content that those bees have been out there gleaning and bringing back home, the nectar from flowers. So, let's say they didn't do it. Now we're in that dearth that happens right after and things are starting to cool down. Do I recommend 1-to-1 sugar syrup at that time of year? Not really. And there's something else that's out here, by the way, and it's called ProSweet. Stuff's expensive, but we're backyard beekeepers. Maybe we can afford it. ProSweet, which is made by Man Lake and put out by Man Lake. I have a 5-gallon pail sitting on the floor right there, which I'm not going to pick up because it weighs a metric ton, theoretically speaking. But that stuff is super dense and it doesn't spoil, and the bees can get that instead of using their own resources. So if you can feed that to them, they will start to store it. The other thing is 1-to-1 sugar syrup that we use during the year, when you've just started a package or you've just collected a swarm, these are bees that need our help. They need a leg up. If it's an established colony, I don't feed them. because they're getting stuff from the environment, and I like to see how they make it through winter. Plus, they do their best job ever of setting up the interior of their hive to get themselves through winter, venting, sealing, insulating, all that stuff. So ProSweet, really thick. Now let's say you don't have ProSweet, but you want to feed them sugar. A sugar syrup in the fall is 2 to 1. 2 parts sugar, granulated cane sugar. Just take my word for it on that, please. Granulated cane sugar to 1 part water. Now that is twice the sugar content. Now is that by volume, like 2 cups of granulated sugar and 1 cup of water? No, it's by weight. So even the 1 to 1 is supposed to be by weight. A lot of people are doing that by volume, which means they're actually giving them a much lighter sugar content than they should be giving the bees. But the 2 to 1, the bees actually treat as a nectar resource that they could store for winter. So they actually start to store the 2 to 1 syrup. They do actually start to store the ProSweet that comes from Mann Lake. I'll give you a link to that so you can read about it. And I'll be using that for the first time this year, ProSweet. I got that over the winter time. They had a sale or something. Might have got it on a Black Friday sale, who knows. But I'm going to be trying out ProSweet. We're going to see what they like. We're going to do some more sugar water tests for the bees after, remember, that we've pulled off any honey that we plan to use. After your flow highs and flow supers have been trained off and we remove those. That's also a great time when we're in that moderate dearth period as the weather starts to turn cold and you've done your honey extractions and everything. Hopefully you held back those frames that you pulled off after doing your honey extraction because they've got honey all over them. They're a mess. They're super sticky. Hopefully you put them in a big tote bin or something like that. Remember, we're not commercial. We don't need a whole warehouse to store that stuff. Totes, heavy duty, big totes that you get like from Home Depot or Lowe's or someplace like that. You can make your own rack and put those inside and stack all of your drawn out frames that have the honey extracted and leave them in there. And then when we hit that dearth period, that's when you set them out away from your hives. I have a feeder station for that. If it's permitted, some countries don't allow open feeding. But then the bees will clean up and sanitize that with their tongues. They're going to clean every part of those frames and they get those resources to bring back. They get super excited about it. We employ those workers and that cuts down on robbing behavior in your apiary because that's the other thing that happens. We have a super colony. We have thousands of bees that are unemployed, clustered on the front, nothing to do. If they find their way into a weakened colony, they're going to rob it out. Weakened colonies might be diseased, they might be sick, they might be miles away from where you live. So do you want your workforce to be out there getting into a colony that's dying possibly from some kind of disease? Or do you want to locally provide something near your apiary like that so that they can clean it up and get that 1-to-1 effort return? Because why do I say that? It's already honey. So when they're cleaning that up and they get that back in here into their colony, they no longer have to dehydrate it or anything else. It's ready to go. It's down under 19% water. So they put that in there, you can bet they're going to go nuts for that, which is also why they rob other colonies. When they get in there and they're not well guarded and they can get past those guards and they start robbing it out, and it's always the big, strong, healthy colonies that are robbing out the weak ones. The ones that need it the least are taking the honey from those who need it the most. Then they're bringing it back and putting it directly in stores, robbing the poor, feeding the rich. I know, it doesn't seem right. So by open feeding at that time of year, you are going to relieve some of that stress because the queen is also going to be backing off on her egg laying, so production is going to slow down and the numbers inside the colony are going to be reduced eventually. But while there's that surplus, that's when your bees are the most hostile towards other bees. We talk about wasps and hornets and things like that rob out colonies, but they are nothing compared to what one honeybee colony can do to another. So anyway, now what would I feed them? That's what I would feed them inside the colony. Now let's talk about liquids. We don't want to feed them liquids as we get into freezing temperatures. So for us, that's 32 degrees or lower during the nighttime because things can go bad and stay bad. We can hit a late October, early November here, and it can get cold and wet and the bees can't fly out and they end up hunkered down inside. We don't want to feed them liquids at that time. They have their honey in there, remember, but the other thing is if you needed to put some kind of emergency system in there to feed them, I put in dry sugar on top in my feeder shims or on top of an inner cover if that's what you have, and I use the Rapid Round Feeder for that because a Rapid Round Feeder can do dry or syrup. And I'll give you a link to that. So that's what I feed, dry sugar, nothing else. I don't put in the patties. There are pollen patties that we can feed them, and then you'll also hear about winter patties, which don't have pollen in them. They're just a resource to get your bees through winter. Usually you put those right on top of the brood frames, which requires you to open your hive, take off the inner cover, get down to where the brood is, and put your patties directly on top of the frames above the brood so the bees have immediate access to that. So I don't personally do that. My resources are up at the top, and then some people will say, but if your cluster's down here, and this is honey, and then you're putting your feed up at the top, well, remember, it's emergency feed. So I don't care that they can't access it way up here on top yet. Why? Because they have honey down here. I don't want them eating emergency feed. They'll eat their normal feed. Now, if they've used up everything they have, they're going to be up under that inner cover already because they're in an emergency state. They've used up all their resources. They're at the top of the colony. How do I know when they're there? I use thermal imaging cameras to shoot the outside of the hives, and I see where the cluster is, and then I know if I see a hot spot here and I have a hive this tall, I know that they have all this food above them, because during the winter they don't go up and come back down. They go up, they stay up. So your emergency feed for me is at the top, and I don't pull the covers, don't pull the boxes, and I don't lay feed in patties because I don't use the patties, but I do not lay that right on the brood because they're already going to migrate up to save themselves while their numbers dwindle continually through the winter. So that's what I feed. Emergency rations. Their own honey is the best for them. By the way, did you know they've been doing studies on the honey as well? The darker the honey when they go into winter. So let's say buckwheat honey. Buckwheat is, it sounds like it would be wheat. It's really not. Buckwheat looks like a big flower plant. Nothing like wheat that you would harvest. But anyway, let's say they get on buckwheat. Buckwheat creates this very dense, very aromatic, dark umber honey. Now, here's the thing about that. The people that study gut biomes and everything else to deal with honeybees and their digestive system and what goes on, the darker the honey, the more mineral content. Therefore, the more they have to go to the bathroom. So, if they have really dark honey in there, they need to do cleansing flights, and they can only do that when it's above 51 degrees and you get a sunny spot. This also lends itself to the discussions about what direction, if you're just setting up your hive and you live in the northern hemisphere and you're in an area where it gets really cold. People that live in the south, they don't care. You can aim your beehives anywhere you want. It makes no difference. Up here where I live, the hives that have south and southeast facing landing boards and entrances get active quicker in the wintertime, and that means they can fly out and do cleansing flights. Those that are facing north in the shade, and I have both because I'm evaluating all of that, they fly less often. They don't get out and do their cleansing flights because the hive doesn't warm up enough. And they have to hold all that on board. So bees can actually get sick. They can get dysentery. So the reason I bring that up is in that study where they evaluate bees in winter and how they manage moisture and how they manage material that they're eating, which is the carbohydrate, which is the honey, which allows them to warm the brood and keep things going through winter and, of course, keep themselves alive. If it's really dark honey, then they're going to need access to the outside more frequently. If it's a very light honey, like what we get from clover, for example, then that honey will require them to go out and eliminate less often. Pretty interesting stuff, by the way. So then also when we're feeding syrups, the heavy syrups, 2-to-1, if they can still take that in, that is going to affect the gut less harshly than their actual own honey, which is kind of interesting. So cleansing flights are very important, and the sugar that we put up there. The other reason I put in dry sugar in the wintertime on top for the emergency feed is it also gives a place for some of that moisture to go. If there is condensation in the upper parts, sometimes it will collect on the dry sugar that you put in there and it'll actually solidify the sugar. So it has a possible desiccant effect. So things like that, that's what I feed, nothing elaborate. So if you're a backyard beekeeper and you really don't need these supercharged numbers going into spring and everything, which is why people feed pollen substitutes and pollen patties and things like that early on, We're talking February, March. It's because they're trying to get the brood built up so that when April and May arrive, they can provide pollination services and also bring in a bunch more nectar and honey. If you're a backyard beekeeper, you're just getting your bees through. So let's move on. Next is from N Hall. Been watching lots of YouTube and your channel's great. Sugar, water with oil, salt, type of water. It interests me. I was wondering if you tried dextrose, corn sugar, or somewhere I saw that bees preferred 1:3 or instead of 1:1 ratio. So again, we're talking about this feeding stuff. I can go right to the corn syrup and stuff, high fructose corn syrup and things that people like to feed their bees. I don't do it. Just don't want to. Based on the studies that I've read, I stick with nothing but granulated processed sugar and water when I'm mixing up any kind of syrup. So the other thing is interesting here, I saw, by the way, if you're submitting a question and you say that you saw, like I heard that, 1:3 or something like that is preferred by the bees, please provide an associated link or the study or something like that so I can look it up. I'd like to know more about it. My mind is always open to new information. I am not solidly set in my ways when it comes to understanding bees and how to care for them. But the 1:3, I'll abandon. Let me explain why. So much research has been done on the amount of sugar that gets used in syrup that's beneficial for the bees in times when they are unable to get their carbohydrates from the environment. And they look at plants and the nectar in plants, by the way, which is not always the same, even from the same plant, because it has to do with rainfall. It has to do with what the environment is doing to that plant, the amount of concentrated sugars that will be in the nectar for that plant. And the bees go to the plants that have the highest sugar content. So how do they figure that out? Well, they did studies and they collected the plants at different times of the day, same plant species, and they find out what the sucrose content is, what the sugar content is in that nectar, and they find out it went all the way up to like 42%, 43%. And the same plant at other times could be down to 20% sugar to water. So then they arrived at how the bees will use the sugar syrups that you mix up. So we know, and this is why we use 1:1 when we just start a new colony, whether it's a swarm that you collect, whether it's package bees that you install. What's a package bee, Fred? You're throwing around these terms. Well, some people buy a cage with a bunch of bees in it, usually sold by the pound, 3 pounds or 5 pounds. 3 pounds would be the norm. And inside that cage is a queen that has nothing to do with the bees that are in the cage, but they'll kind of get used to her scent in transit. They'll ship it through the mail. People can come and pick it up, and you'll have a mated queen in here, and that's your package. Well, they're in jeopardy. First of all, they have to get acquainted with each other. This queen is capable of laying right away, but they also have to build their resources. And what are their resources? They need honeycomb so that they can store food, pollen, nectar, and also so the queen can lay eggs and they can start to develop their brood. So they need to make their own honeycomb. To do that, they found out that the 1:1 by weight, pound of sugar, pound of water, that was the perfect ratio for stimulating those bees to draw out wax. So that's where the 1:1 comes from. It's an energy source. Sure, they can get energy from a variety of those ranges though. But when it comes to actually making beeswax, the 1:1 sugar to water ratio stimulated that and gave them the most usable resource for making comb. There's a saying that there is nothing new under the sun, and that has been well studied and well established. So then the complete flip side of that is the 2:1, 2 parts sugar, 1 part water. By the way, the 1:1, they say, whoever they is, the research, the studies that have been done, that the bees won't actually store the 1:1 sugar syrup in their cells like honey. If so does that mean, whoa, if they don't store it, then I can feed the 1:1 even when I have sugar, when I have the supers on that I'm going to get my honey from, because the 1:1 won't make it in there? I wouldn't guarantee that. So if you want pure honey that comes from plants, don't feed a colony that you plan to derive honey from. But if it's a starter colony, which is what we're talking about, package bees, swarm, not so much the nucleus colonies, but if you have one of those too, you might want to boost them. those are hives that you're not going to be taking honey off of anyway. So whether you feed them internally, sugar syrup or not, totally personal choice, how much you want to boost them. Guess what? When they don't want it and don't need it, they don't use it. So you're going to see your feeder, whatever style it is, you're going to see it not being utilized very much by the bees. But I would not go the other way and say I have a really strong colony, I want to boost it. Sugar's cheaper than honey, I can make a lot of money off the honey. Now you're talking commercial. So we're backyard beekeepers, and we want the honey that we get to be like fine wine. We want it to be perfect honey, floral honey, nothing else in it, non-polluted. So the 2-to-1 on the flip side, they actually can store and treat as honey. Plus they have to dry it down less. So you're not inundating this hive with a high moisture content like the 1-to-1. At a time when they might have to start limit their activities inside the hive because at nighttime it's getting really cold. So 2-to-1. Then when we get the cold frozen snaps, I'm just going to recap that for you. Don't put any syrups in there, even if it's ProSweet. Stop with any of the liquids once we start to get the freezing weather and you have the potential for them to be locked inside that hive. So as far as the 1-to-3, I just can't address it. I haven't read it anywhere. If you want to revisit that and send me the link or the study or something like that, I'm more than happy to look into it and then share more about it later. But for many, many years, it's been widely known that 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 are the primary choices for the syrups. This is from Crazy Rick. I'm just guessing because it says CRZRZK. Another excellent informative video. Those piping queens are obviously communicating something. Now that was a video that showed what was going on in here and the queens were piping. And by the way, this ties in with what's about to be asked here. If you watched that video, if you haven't seen it, please watch it. It's the observation hives forming out, being rehived. You know, they collected on a branch, but there were several queens in here. I had one queen that hatched out and was cruising around, and a really keen-eyed YouTube viewer saw the queen, said she was coming down through here and pausing to lay eggs. Well, she wasn't laying eggs, but it was the queen, and she was tooling around here, and she had a shortened abdomen because she wasn't fertile yet, and she hadn't done her mating flights. So by now we know she's done her mating flights, otherwise the colony would be in a pickle here because she's past her time when she could do that. But what the other thing that happened is all of the other piping stopped, and that's because those queens were discarded or killed. Now the queen could sting them through the cells, or the workers can actually turn on them. But that's what's going on here. The first queen, awesome looking by the way. She's in there, she's doing her thing right now. We're going to see more, so watch this as each week comes along. So if you didn't sub already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss seeing what the queen does and how this hive changes. My question to you is, they're usually after swarms. I've had it happen to one hive 3 times about a week apart. How come the new queen didn't kill those rivals? Everybody says that the first queen to come out is going to hear that piping. She's going to track down the others and she's going to sting them right through the cell. And that's another conversation that comes up too. How come the queen can sting things and not die? And people say things, I read the responses. They say stuff like, well, the queen is stinging another bee or an insect and therefore the stinger doesn't get caught up and doesn't kill the queen. That's partially true. Queens are not going to engage in stinging mammals in general. That's why you can grab a queen by her wings carefully in the thorax, carefully put her in a little marking container and then mark your queens on the thorax if you want to. They're very easy to handle and they're very hesitant to sting unless it's another queen. But the other thing is there is a difference in their stinger design. If you look, obviously you may not have stereo microscopes and things like that, but if you look at a queen's stinger, it does have a very tiny serration, but for all practical purposes, it is a single appendage and it is very smooth. There's a tiny serration, but nothing like the workers. The worker bees, when their stinger is extended, it's a 2-part stinger. The serrations go up one side of each of those parts. There's a muscle attached, and the serration is very pronounced. And when it just pricks your skin barely and that thing flies away, you see a little gooey string go out, and then there's a muscle on there that acts autonomously. That little muscle keeps pulsing to put venom in, which is why people tell you, scrape across that stinger, get it right out of your skin, And don't grab it, squeeze it, tweeze it, anything like that, because you're forcing more venom in. But another thing is going on. Remember, as they come together, they're only serrated on one side. So what's happening is that muscle's also causing that stinger to do this. Pulls itself in, pulls itself in, pulls itself in, pulls itself in. And if you left it unattended, does it go all the way in? Does it disappear under your skin? No. But what happens is it buries itself nice and deep, and then the only part that you see sticking up at the skin is going to be that little ball, which is the venom and the muscle that causes that movement. So they are different fundamentally in design as well as intended purpose. A lot of people think, why do wasps sting over and over, but the honeybee stings, leaves its stinger, and dies, while a wasp stings and gets to fly away? By the way, some people refer to the honeybee as the vegan wasp, vegetarian wasp. Anyway, they have fuzz on them. So the honeybee actually might be considered more brilliant, because if you kill a wasp, it can't sting anymore. You kill the bee, the stinger's dislodged, it stays there and continues to deliver venom even after that tiny defensive warrior bee has been killed or flown off to die or anything else. The stingers remain, the stingers continue to do their work even after that individual is dead. So which is the most sophisticated? I don't know. But there are those differences. So another thing is, this queen did not kill the other queens in these cells. And let me tell you what happens. Honeybees have favorites, even among queens, even while they're developing. And you can see it, I can't see it this year, but in past years, when queen cells were along the bottom of these frames, I got to watch the bees' behavior. So there are a lot of tells that let you know that those workers, the nurse bees inside, that are guarding the queen while she's in a pupa state. Now the pupa state, they're larvae while they're open celled and they're being fed. They're eggs until they hatch into larvae. And then the larvae, as soon as they're sealed up by the workers, that's actually a job in the hive to seal caps. Once that's sealed, now it's a pupa. Requires no more feeding or anything else. So why are these workers clustered all around that planter's peanut looking shell? It's because they've actually chosen a favorite developing queen. There are a lot of ways we can tell which are their favorites. One is the physical size of the queen cell. Might be about that long. The other thing is, how much work do they do? When you really like something, you spend a lot of time ornamenting it, contouring it, shaping it, working it out. You don't care about it, she's covered, she's got her cell, it's a queen cell, it's the largest cell in the hive, but it's fairly smooth with a few ripples. So when we're looking at queen cells all spread out, sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, you'll see a couple that have a lot more indents on them, like the planter's peanut shell. They have a lot more dimples than others. It seems more ornamented, it seems fancier, it's reinforced, there's more beeswax on it. Those bees have shown a preference for that developing queen. And they cluster, and every now and again you'll see them vibrate their thorax on it, checking. I don't know if they're trying to get her to come out or if they're just letting them know we're here for you. But then you'll see another cell over here has 1 or 2 workers on it ready to assist the queen when she emerges. But the one over here that's in the fancy cell with lots of reinforcements, and the one that's over here in the smooth cell with just a couple casual bees hanging out on it to take care of that queen. When that queen over here hatches out, this doesn't always happen, but it can happen. The queens over here that have their preferred queen, when she goes over here and says, I'm going to sting through your cell, they're like, nope. And those guard bees guard them off of that queen. They don't want to let her die, and they ensure that she actually gets to hatch out. So this queen over here gets to do what? She hauls out of there because the bees aren't taking care of her. This is how we get these micro swarms, these after swarms. Sometimes you get a swarm of bees. I got called for a swarm of bees about 4 miles away, and they were like this big on a little branch, which I took as a personal, project, a challenge to see if I can get them to survive. They're underdogs. What's likely is that's an after swarm. First of all, look how tiny they are. The other thing, the queen's not mated yet, so she flew out. She's not mated, so haphazard group of workers left with her and created this micro after swarm. So a lot of things have to happen to make that one work. We're going to feed them based on the stuff that we talked about before. We're going to give her a small space to occupy. so that the workers can actually multitask. They're underdogs, and we're going to, try to take care of them. She has to do a mating flight. So these other bees that hatch out that fly away with these microswarms and cause these numbers to dwindle. If you notice, look at the numbers in here. They did the swarm out. We established that swarm into a hive. We collected them. They're doing fantastic. That's the old queen. The new queen, there were no after swarms. Look at these numbers. So these numbers are strong. This is a big resource here. That's because the first queen that came out was the one that they liked, and they didn't have to have any other after swarms. So they did kill off those remaining queen cells. So what I'm suggesting here for Rick is that they didn't kill off, the queen did not kill off those others because they were being favored by the workers inside, and they were holding that queen in reserve, and the others were then forced to swarm out as after swarms. So that's what happened. Could it have been something else? Sure. My word is not the final word. I'm just giving you the information based on my direct observations through 14 years of beekeeping and fairly intensive observations. I spent a lot of time just evaluating, staring at bees. Not like men who stare at goats. I mean, I can't manipulate the bees with my mind. I wish I could. They would all stay and be super healthy. But we get a lot of information just from watching the bees day by day and paying careful attention to their conduct towards one another. That's what I suspect happened. Next one, Nurse Steve. Fred, I have a new Langstroth hive box with 2 brood boxes and 1 super. 2 brood boxes, so that would be 2 broods. 1 super would be up here. And the top cover that came with it does not have any notches on the side. Should there be one? Also, bottom board is not screened. Should I order one with a screen? My box is empty at the moment since I've not yet ordered a nuke or caught a swarm. Okay, so this comes down to personal preferences, and if you're a brand new beekeeper, I apologize because there's a lot of dissension that carries on forever and ever about venting, not venting, inner hive cover designs and everything else, but we'll talk about some of this. Let's address the inner cover first. The notch that we're talking about, this is probably going to throw you for a loop. See this notch right here? This would be an inner cover. This is not an ordinary inner cover. See, it's clear. It's plexiglass because this is a weird 8-frame inner cover that's designed to sit on your hive so that you can open the outer cover and look inside without smoking or doing anything and seeing what your bees are doing. So, kind of cool, But guess what's missing? There's no feeder hole here. So this is just for observation, but the bees have an upper entrance through there. How much space does a bee need to get through? Bee space is, 3/8 of an inch. So the bees can come and go. So if this is the box, this would be the notch that we're talking about that the bees come and go through. Sometimes it's a smaller notch, but this is also serves as an upper vent. So under here, we would have brood or honey supers, and they would vent up through the top as well as draw air through the landing board. Now, Nurse Steve has another type of inner cover. This is more standard too. This has what looks to be kind of like Luan or something here. It's a thin plywood. And this is a normal inner cover. And now we're talking about a 10-frame inner cover, and there are no notches on it. So then if you don't have notches, you don't need to cut notches. If you're just using it for venting, you can put a couple nickels up here. Sometimes I used to run screws into them and back the screw up a little. And then when we put the outer cover over this, it would stand up a little. Air passes through the center, which is really a feeder hole. And then it would vent out through the top. So if you live in a hot climate somewhere, this might be a very useful thing. But also remember that when you're venting through the top of your hive, summer or winter, you are venting off. If you live in an arid region, desert Southwest or something, you're venting off valuable humidity that the bees need to take care of their brood. So it's not just heat, they need humidity. And the bees can circulate stuff through. So the other thing was, the bottom boards here. Bottom board not screened. So your brand new beekeeper, dizzying collection, it might seem, of bottom boards to choose. So we're going to talk about, here's one bottom board design. Ever see this before? This is Bee Smart Design's Ultimate Hive Bottom, which goes with their hive stands. I've done a full review of all of this stuff, but this has integrated preventive blocks that go in here that can keep mice from getting in. You have control of vents, but on the underside, we put a piece of plastic core flute, whatever you want to call it, that slides in on the bottom. So we have a screen bottom board. This has a single position. So there's always a space between the screen and the inserted bottom board here. So you have the option, pull the bottom insert out altogether and let this be a screened open bottom board, which the bees seem to be able to handle, by the way. It also means that it helps them in IPM. What the heck is IPM? Integrated Pest Management. So if you have bees that are trying to get rid of small hive beetles, let's say, or they're scratching off the varroa mites. These are destructor mites that cling to the bodies of bees. If they can scrape them off, they'll fall through the screen and they'll leave the hive. They'll drop right out on the bottom. So could this be a good resource as a bottom board? Sure can. And that pest management thing is no joke. Plus, when you put this core flute in the bottom, you can spray PAM on it, or you can cover it with Crisco, or do whatever you want to do to trap and make stick things like the small hive beetles or any of the little varroa mites so they don't get back up there. Here's another screened bottom board. I told you, it's a lot of decisions to be made. This is for an 8-frame hive. It has no insert underneath. There are people that keep bees where I live in the snow belt, and they swear by these open bottom screened boards even without core flute or a barrier. I've never had the nerve to put a colony of bees through that, so I have to take their word for it that what that did was it allowed condensation to leave the hive through the bottom exclusively. So the upper parts of the hive have no venting or anything else. They just leave those bottom boards screened, open, venting through winter. So here's another hive. This is a bottom board of a standard flow hive, and it has already tilted shims on the sides of it. And this is but the reason I wanted to show you this is it has this inserted core flute. I make my own, by the way, because they just don't last long, and I wanted to use this opportunity to talk to you about thoughts on your inserts when you're doing that. Now, the way the flow hive is, it's got 2 levels on the back. So right now it's in the closed, or what they would call the winter position, but then there's another lower summer position, or you can pull it out all together, and it can be screened and open, so you have all those options available. So the one that comes with a standard flow hive has 3 positions. Top position, snugged all the way to the top. Second one down, there's a gap between the screen and the bottom, or out altogether, open, and your stuff goes right through. Let me tell you one of the reasons I don't like it for the flow hive. So if you're one of the flow hive people, don't watch, because I'm about to be critical. With these out, if there's any leaking, when you cycle these flow frames, sometimes they leak a little bit. You know, these are covered in wax cappings, and then you cycle it, and these cells open up, and it starts to drain out. It's supposed to come out this trough here, which it does. Some of the honey runs down the face. Some of the honey drips onto this board, and based on the way it's configured, it also will follow this board, and a little bit of that honey drips out the back, and then what happens? Other bees in your apiary might start robbing. So let's say we took it out. Now we have an open screen bottom board with that particular traditional flow hive base. The original. Now any honey that leaks collects underneath the here, and bees come and glom onto it. And then what happens? They start looking for other ways to get to the honey that they smell through the bottom. So in the flow hive, I don't like these open screen bottom boards because of that, the honey going through. If it leaks, and sometimes it does, especially if it's your first cycling of a first flow super. But I want to talk to you about the core flute now. I buy these in bulk. I get big boxes of them from Amazon. Cut them myself. So when you're sliding them in, sometimes the corners get caught up. So here's what I do. I nip off the corners, just like that. The other thing is when it slides into the whichever hive, whether it's the Bee Smart Designs Ultimate Bottom Board or whether it's the Flow Hive or another design that allows these to slide in and out, I cut these a full inch too long. Why do I do that? Because when I put it in there, you're going to find out when you have these, sometimes they're very hard to get out if you've ignored them for a while. Wax drips down, propolis and stuff gets dropped down there and they just gum up. So it gives you something to grab onto to pull it out easier. Where if it's flush with the back, now we have to get in there and get a hold of it, and it's hard and frustrating. And of course they wear out, so you pull it out, clean it off, then you flip it over. Now you insert it this way. This is my least favorite method. So the ones that use those inserts are, of course, the Ultimate Hive Bottom Board by Bee Smart Designs, the Flow Hive's standard, the Flow Hive first iteration of their bottom board designs. Now they have the Flow Hive 2. Hands down, the best bottom board system on any hive I've ever had, because it's a combination of, it's got a nice tray in there, so no core flute. It can close up for winter, you have venting control, and you have a great place to capture Varroa and stuff like that. You could pull it all the way out and leave it exposed just like a screen bottom board, but instead it's a piece of aluminum that has slats cut in it that the bees can't get through. So that's my favorite. Should I order one with a screen? That is going to be personal preference. I also like solid bottom boards in winter, and I leave the front vent open. See what's working where you live. Next, David Koch. I have about 10 to 12 hives, and most make it through winter, but in April or May, they supersede the queen on average 2 times, sometimes within 30 days. Of course, this puts the honey collection way behind. I do treat for mites with oxalic acid vaporization 3 times and again in December. I do mark the queens, so I know they're superseding the present queen. Any ideas on why this is happening? Thank you for your question and answer videos. Very informative. Okay, for David, here's the thing. It would seem that by now we would have answers to everything when it comes to beekeeping, and we just don't. Sometimes the reason that a queen gets superseded is beyond our knowledge. It's something that the bees know. So they drive off their old queen, and they may just put her out. It may not even be a swarm. She may just not be functioning well, and they could discard a queen, or she could leave with a tiny swarm that just doesn't make it and you didn't catch it because they're not noticeable. They're little. Supersedure is something that for beginning backyard beekeepers might be new. Queens create swarm cells, they create supersedure cells. So generally that term, supersedure, means queen's being replaced. Why? She's not functioning well. So that is something that the bees have done on their own, and marking your queens is a good idea if you like to know if your bees have been gone. But I think what's most important is what's going on in the colony with the new queen, if she's laying, if they're building up, if things are going well. Everyone would like to hold on in spring, but spring is the natural time for hives to divide. The new year, we've got a winter colony that made it through. If their numbers came out strong and they've got enough surplus bees to go ahead and generate a swarm, and then they can replace her, and they're going to that spring nectar flow, that is a sign of a super healthy colony of bees. So again though, David mentions you're going to lose all that honey. That's true. If this was a commercial beekeeping operation, that would be terrible. And you would really wanting to figure out how to keep as many bees as possible, so then you could provide as much pollination service as possible and glean as many honey resources as possible to make money from them. But I don't have, a single solid answer for why that happened, only that it's healthy for bees to turn over their queen stock. This is from Jane. My question: as there is apparently no way of knowing if there is a hot hive nearby, is there any way of knowing this has happened to your hive until you and the creatures in your vicinity are under attack? If you want to know if there's a hot hive, and I think this question was submitted because we were dealing with an Africanized colony of bees that had killed chickens, stung a bunch of hogs, and attacked the beekeepers with their bee suits on, and one beekeeper was stung with his bee suit on more than 50 times, and they followed him more than 1,000 yards down the road. So, with there any way of knowing that that's happening coming up? Well, it does come down to familiarity with your own colony. You're unlikely to be attacked by a hot hive unless you own it. Why? Because where are they going to do their attacking? They're defending. They're going to defend where they live. So this is probably going to be one of your own colonies. It's not going to be somebody down the road whose colony flew over here and just attacked you out of the blue. So foraging, would you know when you're encountering hot bees from hot hives? Generally no, because when you would encounter them, if they're not your bees, they're just out foraging and feeding, which means they're less defensive. But as you get close to where they reside, as you get close to the cavity that they occupy, whether that's a tree in the woods or whether that's a colony in a hive that you own, you're going to know the difference right away. When I go through my apiary daily and I sit and look at all my colonies very closely. So if they put out a bunch of guard bees come out and they start looking at you and they start tilting their little heads and they get closer and closer, and then you'll see some of the guard bees will take wing. So now they're going to encourage you to walk away. A hot hive will demonstrate defensive behavior. More guards on deck. They deploy those guards as soon as you walk into the bee yard. They generally don't wait for you to walk right up to the hive. But then if you do start to get bees that are overly defensive, you're just walking near your bee yard and all of a sudden, the one guard, there's always one that has a problem. There's always one that comes out there and just comes after you for no reason. That's not indicative of a hot hive. That is one honeybee that has issues. As you get closer, if you've got 10, 15 bees or more that are in your face, that are pinging your veil, if hopefully you have a veil on if they're acting like that, they're trying to sting you and you haven't even approached a hive, you've got an issue somewhere in your apiary, and now it's time to go and put on your full garb, your full length bee suit. This is my Max Protect natural apiary bee suit that I wear if I'm dealing with hornets that are really aggressive or if I'm dealing with hot hives that might just attack for no apparent reason. You have to be prepared to cope with them. You need a full bee suit. You need protective gear. You need a plan. So you may not know that because they can seem to have a personality change very quickly, but if you're making daily visits to your apiary, you will begin to realize that one of those hives is hot, that one of those hives is abnormal. They might not have a queen. They might be getting attacked at night frequently by some mammal that lives nearby. They might have a skunk raiding them. We don't know what they're going through, and this is also why I put video cameras on my apiary so I know if there's an animal out there, I know which hive it's working on, and I start to realize what the weaknesses are of the hive itself. Maybe it's too low to the ground, I need to raise it, things like that. So it's not always the genetics of the bees, it might be what they're enduring. The other thing is when you get a really hot hive, a super hostile hive that's super confident, sends out a whole bunch of defensive, overly defensive guards, generally it's not a tiny colony of bees. Usually it's one of your really big colonies that can actually put thousands of bees out if they need to. Heaven forbid it's an Africanized colony of bees, because I had a nurse come up to me. I was at the hospital doing a routine checkup, and he was an individual that had seen one of my videos. He came up to me in the hall and he said, "Hey, I had bees come after me so heavy. They clustered on his veil to the point that he could not see through the veil. And the more he tried to clear them, the more angry they got." And of course, because I want to share it with you, I was like, "Hey, would there be any way that I could come over to your house and make a video and everything? Nobody's going to see it. Could I just see what happens with those bees?" He said no. He wouldn't even tell me where he lives. He wouldn't tell me where he keeps his bees. He was afraid of being labeled an irresponsible beekeeper. But that's a moment when something like that happens. The good news is bees like that don't make it through winter. The bad news is if you're living somewhere where you have houses right next to you or where children play, those are the showstoppers for me. If there's a child involved, if there's something nearby, if they're killing livestock, I go there for free to help people out. Unfortunately, for people's privacy, I am very grateful that one couple allowed me to make a video for educational purposes, figuring out which of the hives was hot, figuring out where the attack came from. It becomes very conspicuous. So if you're concerned about being in the vicinity of hot hives, it's only going to be your own apiaries that are going to be emitting that attack. It's going to be one of your own colonies, because they don't do it when they're out foraging, they're defending, you're in their zone. Those of you who live in southern states or in the state of Texas or Arizona or parts of the desert Southwest, there's a disproportionate number of Africanized bees out there. Hot hives might be a lot easier to find. Up here where I live, it's a rarity. It's usually because somebody brought bees up during the summer, packages, nucleus colonies or something like that. They installed them. They did not know the genetics. And of course, when you get a package of bees, you don't know the disposition of those bees. You might dump out that package of bees and put your queen cage in there and pull the candy plug out, so they can get to the candy and so they can eat through to the queen and release her. Wow, these bees are really calm. These bees are really cool. This is going to be good to work with. You don't know what those bees are yet. These are the bees in the package that whoever sold you those bees just dumped them all through a funnel and into this package and stuck this queen in there with them. The genetics are in the queen who's been mated. You're not going to know that until those babies start hatching 21 to 30 days out after the install. That's when you're going to find out what the personality of your colony is. And even when they first hatch out, you're not going to know right away because those are nurse bees, and there's nothing nicer than a nurse bee on the brood frame. So as they get older, as their bodies toughen up, as they become capable of other things, including leaving the hive, that's when you're going to find out what the real personality of those bees are. Anyway, I've talked enough about that. Have a contingency plan, have a full protection bee suit, and have big plastic bags or something just in case things go really bad. Rose Robertson. I think being a compassionate and responsible beekeeper ought to provoke many questions for both new and seasoned beekeepers. I agree. I don't think one can ever learn enough about God's creatures. I agree. You can never know too much. You can never be too healthy. You can never be too fast or too smart, blah, blah. Thank you for your expanded response to using OA vaporization in the horizontal hive, not being able to afford a ProVap, which looks like it more forcefully blows vapor, and so on. This leads me to my first flaw that I have discovered in my Long Langstroth horizontal hive. Rose's problem here is, first of all, that ProVape that I use, ProVap 110, which is what I put oxalic acid vaporization in the hives with. I can do it with the observation hive here. I can do it with my horizontal hive through a 1/4-inch hole. Most people use a pan to deliver oxalic acid vaporization. Well, guess what? My horizontal Long Langstroth hive has no way for you to do that. First flaw. Because the entrance is a 1/2-inch, 6-inch long entrance, and it hits the frames at 90 degrees. There's no place to put a pan in. So there you have it. First flaw. Wade Barnes. So you had the whole bottom open screen bottom board, or just opening itself so that the bees can go in and out of? Seems like a truncated question. The thing is really the difference between my hives having full open bottom boards with screens in them as compared to traditional. I'm going to show you this drawing. This shows the venting that a lot of beekeepers use. Excuse me. They have an entrance reducer that's made out of wood, and then they cut the opening appropriate to the number of bees. Then there's a brood box. Usually it's a deep. Then there's a medium super. Some people have an upper entrance. I used to do that myself. The upper entrance is usually a 3/4-inch diameter hole that we cut into the handhold so it has some shelter from rain. Upper vent, upper entrance. Then we have the inner cover with a little vent cut in that. So more upper venting, and then the outer cover, which is telescoping down over the top of that. Then people adjust the size of this opening in the wooden frame, the wooden entrance reducer, appropriate to the number of bees capable of defending that. Here's the configuration I've arrived at. I have a feeder shim on top that I make myself. It has an inner cover built in. It has these little vent holes that are screened in that built-in inner cover. It has a central feeding hole, and I used a rapid round feeder up there. My bees in every one of my colonies where I have this feeder shim have propolized that screen. So what they did is they sealed these things up completely so no venting goes up through here, and that's what the bees chose to do. So by leaving these on year round, we find out how they configure their hive themselves. I don't put venting in this super as I used to over here. And then there's the brood box, and of course any other box that you have below this. Now when it comes to my landing board, I have opted now, unless it's a brand new colony, tiny colony of bees that I captured as a swarm or as a package or something else. I start them right out with rolled aluminum screen, and then I just make the screens different lengths depending on how big I want this opening to be. And that's my configuration today. My favorite configuration, unless it's one of the flow hives because they have their own bottom board on it. I like solid bottom boards. I tilt the whole hive forward towards the bottom board. And I use screen for entrance reducers. And that also, by the way, those screens serve to let me know if there's a skunk or something visiting that colony at night, because what'll the skunk do? Pull that screen out. But on the flip side of that, if there's a robbing colony of bees, if they're starting to attack a hive and we've got screens in place, they can't get through the screen. Where if we had a wooden entrance reducer and we put that in there and we make the entrance really small, now we've shut down on their ventilation a lot. So that actually challenges the bees at a time when they're trying to vent and dehydrate their honey. So we want to make sure to give them enough ventilation, and I do all of my ventilating now through the entrance, through the bottom board. All last winter I did no top venting at all. Tilting your hive forward is critical because if any condensation builds up in the top, I should have shown you this morning because it dropped into the low 50s overnight. When it came out here, all of this is dry and warm, much like it would be inside your hive, and then the dew point was achieved down here. There was a ring of moisture on this glass here, and that's much like what happens inside your hive. If you've got an encapsulated upper part that the bees control, they conserve all this heat, and they tell us that they want to because they're the ones that sealed it up. I left them with screen vents in the top. Even this observation hive has screens on either side at the top that are 1.5 inches in diameter. Those don't vent anymore because the bees have sealed those up. So I leave my hive configurations the same, summer and winter. If anything, I'll put a polystyrene lid on a hive. But that's even unnecessary because remember, if I put a polystyrene lid up here, I also have this thick material, feeder shim, that goes on top of here. So it would have to leak through here. The air cannot rise through the rapid round feeder because it has a cover on it, but that's a thin piece of plastic. So we have open air up here, and then we have an insulated telescoping cover that rests solidly on the entire circumference of this upper box. So there are no leak paths for air movement above this entrance down here. Well, the way I used to do it, you can see it if you look at my old videos, I had these entrances with the wooden entrance reducers. I had the upper entrances also, which are also venting, and I had inner cover ventilation with this notching here. So I've completely changed from this to that. And again, so these are differences in based on climate, based on region, based on prevailing winds and everything else, how much rain you get. These things can change beekeeper to beekeeper. So unless you're, I've done both ways. Upper venting, and I did my upper venting probably 10 years ago intentionally because there was a study that was done up in Canada where the hives did better with the upper vents and upper accesses, upper entrances. So if your bees are in jeopardy of plugging up a bottom entrance down here with dead bodies in winter because older bees die out in winter and then they just pile up on the entrance and can eventually stop your bees from getting in or out, aside from also eliminating your ability for the bees to move air in and out of the hive. So that's where the multiple entrances come in. If there's an upper entrance, it never gets plugged. It never gets closed off as far as venting goes. So if you've got out yards and things like that that you can't get to, that's probably a really good move. But if it's in your backyard, we're talking about backyard beekeeping, then I can see my hives. I can go out there in the middle of a snowstorm if I want to and clear out that bottom entrance to make sure it's well vented. So I'm going to continue with that this year, no upper vents. I'll give them the opportunity, but if they seal it up, I'm not going to open those up again and say, no, don't seal up those upper vents. I want you to have your air vented, so I'm going to give you an opening up there because you're just bees and you don't know. Now, in colder climates, that might be necessary. There are a lot of different configurations. Find out somebody who keeps bees where you live, see what gets their bees through winter, and what causes failure. So we definitely don't want moisture dropping down on top of your bees. If you're going to insulate anything, insulate that top cover. Here's Noah Ziegert. Do I still have a chance for catching swarms? My flow hive is ready, but I'm worried I won't get my hive occupied this year. Well, Noah, I don't know where Noah lives. If you're in the southern hemisphere, of course, they're starting out, so I'm just going to guess northern hemisphere. It is really kind of too late to start a hive, but now I'm going to be a huge hypocrite. Because last year, late September, I collected swarms, and because I was evaluating Better Comb by Better Bee, I hived those swarms. I hived 5 of them. Excuse me. I hived 5 of them. They seemed like they would be doomed. They would have been. Because they need lots of warmth, they need lots of nectar, they need lots of resources to draw and comb. But because Better Comb's pre-drawn, it's ready to go, it's ready for them to use. It actually got those colonies through winter in a single deep. What's a single deep? If you took this, and this was the whole hive box, and you took away all of these, it was one box, feeder shim, cover. That's it, with a swarm of bees, late season. Fed them sugar syrup. The weather got cold, 2-to-1 sugar syrup. The weather got colder than that, went to freezing. Dry sugar on top, nothing else. And then I went and I ordered 5 packages of Saskatraz bees because I knew they weren't going to make it, but I was just going to document how they did. Then in the spring, of course, what happened? They were all alive and thriving. It was amazing to me. So then I had 5 extra colonies of bees. That's how I ended up with 15 colonies. Now I have 20 colonies, and now, so it goes. 20 colonies of bees, it's too many. And then somebody else said, hey Fred, since you have a bunch of extra colonies, you just let me know, I'll come and get one of them, and you can sell them to me. Well, back up your trolley just a little, because now that I have 20 colonies, I have the opportunity to do other studies that involve more numbers of bees in order for me to do a better evaluation. The more numbers, the better your percentages will be, the more valid your findings will be, and so on. So I've decided to go ahead. I have another bee yard now that I've started, which is where the Long Langstroth hive is, which is just east of this one, and another one north of this one by 15 miles. So we're starting satellite hives, satellite apiaries, and we're going to see how things go. So no, thank you for offering to come and buy one of my colonies, but I'm actually just going to expand the kind of research I do. So it's turned out to be a bonus. Plus, thanks to COVID-19, I'm stuck here. Not stuck, I mean my yard's awesome. But it impacted my normal economic influx in the way of wedding photography. That's right, I photograph weddings. Normally I do 30 weddings a year. Guess what I'm doing this year? 5 total. And they're just tiny backyard things. They're all scaled back. So actually, I've had more time to work with my bees now than ever, and that may have changed for me, for those in the hospitality industry henceforth. Some photographers went completely under this year. Some DJs went completely under this year. This has nothing to do with bees, but I'm just letting you know that's why I'm expanding my apiary. That's why I'm doing more research. That's why I have the opportunity to make more videos that I share with you here on YouTube. Peter Zwag, thanks Fred. As always, your sessions engender more questions for a beginner. With the contingency, Queen Cups you mentioned, what happens in an emergency situation? By the way, let me back up for those of you who are new, Queen Cups. Queen Cups are larger cells that sometimes you see around the edges. It looks like the top of an acorn, like an acorn cap, a little smaller than that, and there's nothing in it. It's the beginnings of a queen cell that may never get beyond that stage. A queen cup becomes a queen cell when an egg gets laid in it. So with the contingency queen cups, you mentioned what happens in an emergency situation such as a split. What's a split? Splits when you take a strong colony, you divide their resources in half, you pull a bunch of brood frames out of there, and you leave brood frames behind, and usually you take the existing queen with the split and let the residual resources get used by the new queen that will hatch out. When the colony suddenly has no queen to lay an egg in a cup, do the workers transfer an egg larva to an existing cup, or do they rebuild a chosen queen to be a regular cell into a queen cell? I assume a regular cell is not big enough to raise a queen. I've Googled and can't find the answer yet. Okay. This is a philosophical thing in some cases because a lot of very seasoned senior beekeepers dispute one another's methods for this. So I'm just going to tell you mine and take it or leave it because this is my logic. Let's say there was open brood through here. Open brood. That means eggs have hatched and they're being developed. And how long do they do that before they get capped? Roughly 9 days from the time an egg is laid to the time it gets capped. So if we have open brood, can any of those just be turned into a queen at any time? Nope. Has to be an egg or an egg that is very recently hatched. I'm talking about within 48 hours. The fresher, the better. So let's say there are a bunch of eggs and open brood here. And then something happened to the queen. She got injured. She got rejected. She was kicked out. So when they're kicking her out, they're superseding her, which means that it's not a normal swarm. A supersedure can happen in an emergency as described here. That beekeeper got in there and pulled those frames right out of the middle without pulling them from the side, and the queen was on that frame, and they rolled the queen because they pulled these two frames that were close together, the queen rolled and her feet got messed up, and they actually ended it. So now they're in an emergency situation. That's just hypothetical. Nobody's ever going to pull a frame straight out of the middle of a brood box. So anyway, now these bees have to decide. They're going to pick an egg, preferably, and then they will just start to enlarge the cell, and they'll build it out, and it'll come off the face of that comb, but because there's another comb adjacent to that, it gets this shape where it comes off the face, and then it bends straight down. So it comes out, does a 90, it kind of goes down. So it looks like a drooping queen cell. That's a supersedure cell that they did hastily. Now, this other question about whether or not bees pick up eggs, move them to a cell so that the others can do it. I've never seen it. Some people claim it. People are not documenting it that have seen these eggs, and some will make the argument that there's a queen excluder. Look, there were drones up there. How'd they get up there? If the queen couldn't get through, that means a worker took a cell. No, because there's such a thing as a laying worker that could be up above there, that could be laying those eggs, and they can only make drones. So there's a lot of variables here. The other thing, there's something called, you may come across this as a new beekeeper. Somebody will say, I practice OTS, queen rearing. That's called on-the-spot queen rearing. And that means the beekeeper, you or me, looked at the frame here of brood and there's a bunch of eggs, and we see eggs that we like. And so then we take our hive tool and we smush down the adjacent cells. We damage them. That inspires the bees to recognize that particular cell with an egg in it or a larva that just barely hatched, and then they'll start to build that one out. Here's my problem with that method. The bees themselves know better which eggs they want to develop into queens. They do a better job than we do. That's just my opinion. My opinion can be flawed. But I would rather the queen, the worker bees, the nurses, make that selection of which one of these eggs or just hatched eggs is going to be their future queen. They're going to do a better job of picking it. The other thing is they might do more than just one. They might do a couple of them and so on. But the bees will take a regular cell with a regular egg that was laid by the queen before something happened to her, and they will develop that cell until it's large enough for a queen to occupy it in her pupa state. So that's what they do. They take it from a regular cell. It is highly unlikely and probably very rare, if it happens, that a worker bee would pick up an egg, transport it to a queen cup, put it in there, and then all the nurse bees rush over and start taking care of that. Now, could they physically do that? They have mandibles. They can pick up eggs. But in general, the only time that worker bees will grab an egg would be to consume it when it's where they don't want it to be. It's unlikely that they would take it and install it as if it were just laid by the queen. They're much more likely to pick an egg that's been laid by the queen in a cell that was already there, because that's the norm. Not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying it's unlikely. And if somebody has a video of a worker bee collecting an egg, moving it to another cell, and installing it there with their mandibular glands and creating the stuff that sticks it there, which is a lot like royal jelly. An egg, when you look at it in a cell and the queen lays that egg fresh, it's very dry looking. And that little egg, when it first, let's say this is the cell, that little egg's going to stick just like this when the queen just deposited it. Then a little later, it falls over. 3 days, it hatches. The moment that little egg hatches and there's a larva there, that's when the nurse bees get in there and start creating a little pool of royal jelly for it. And somebody else is going to say, Fred, royal jelly is only for queens. Royal jelly gets fed to every caste. There are 3 castes: queens, workers, males, which are drones. They all get fed royal jelly. The question is, for how long? The queen will get fed royal jelly throughout her development, all the way up until she gets capped and becomes a pupa. So she gets fed more than twice as much as a worker bee that's developing. The composition of her food is different as that goes forward. The composition of the worker bee, that's where they get bee bread and stuff. That's what's up there in the pollen stores. I don't see any to point out, but they get fed bee bread. So initially, they're all fed the same thing. The question is how much of it they're going to be fed and for how long. So that's how that works. I hope that answered that question. Regular cell's not big enough. They're going to draw that right out. Ooh, we're on my last question. Shane Hoskins. And this is from Pocatello, Idaho. Starting keeping bees this year, I installed 2 Saskatraz packages. If you don't know, Saskatraz bees are kind of a big hit in the northern area now. They're bred in California. The Olivarez family has the license to breed those and sell them. They're sold through Mann Lake, and they were developed in Saskatchewan, Canada. So they're supposed to be super cold tolerant. And let me tell you something. This is my 2nd year with them. They're doing really well. Not only that, this year they're demonstrating better hygienic behavior than the ones I got last year. So pretty cool stuff. So anyway, I installed 2 Saskatraz packages on April 25th. I have 1 strong hive and 1 that has struggled. I added a deep honey super on June 5th. On July 10th, I added a flow super. Since 8 of the super frames were capped and the other 2 were almost ready to be capped today, August 4th. I decided to pull a flow frame out and discovered that the bees have propolised every joint but haven't done anything else. Is there anything I can do to get them to start using them? Okay, this comes up often. Flow frames are different from any other frame on the market. In a way, they're, of course, genius. They've gotten lots of awards in Australia. It was the biggest and most successful Indiegogo campaign ever. And the thing is, there's a lot of moving parts in here. So these pieces go together. See if you can take a look at that. The cells are split and parts of it slide, which means the bees have to get in there and seal all those joints up first thing. Once the joints are full, sealed, cell looks like this. Normally we're looking straight in at the top of it. They seal all these joints along here and of course across the bottom. And the cool part is on the end frames we can also see them sealing up the joints and stuff. So the bees do that work. All that work is done ahead of time before they start to store their nectar in there and before they turn it into their honey stores, which is the whole design of it. When it gets activated, it opens like this and it forms a channel and the honey drips out and goes down into a trough and comes out through a tube and so on. The most common question I get is, my bees are not using that flow super. Why not? What's going on? I feel like I wasted my money and so on. First of all, if it's your first year with a colony of bees, the flow super with those mechanized frames generally will only work on the strongest, most populated colonies. The reason is those bees are going to make a huge surplus, huge workforce. They're going to bring in, whenever there is a nectar flow, they're going to bring in the most resources in the shortest amount of time. They're going to run out of places to put it. And the thinking is they're going to go up into that flow super and they're going to put them in those cells. So all this prep work is being done ahead of time. That's actually the hard work. That's why once those cells are sealed one time, once that flow frame has been cycled the first time, the second time, they rework the existing wax and propolis that's already there. So they're not bringing it in fresh and having to do it all like tuck pointing a bunch of bricks and stuff. They're not having to bring in a bunch of new materials to do that. Once they're put back in a position, the raw material that they use to seal that up, wax and propolis, is still there. So then they seal it up much faster the next time around, and then they go straight into storing their honey in there. So, but it's getting them to do it the first time that is the tough part for a lot of people. And what's being described by Shane here is that the colony is pretty strong. They've already shown that they can do wax production. They've already shown that they filled a bunch of frames and boxes, and the box right under where the flow super is going to be is pretty much full, 80%. So they should do it. Now, I don't know, let's see, this is Idaho. I don't know what the nectar flow cycle is there, if you've already gone through it, if it's upcoming. They may never finish it this year. So what should you do? What if they don't finish that? What if they just did all that work and everything, and now the cells are half full, they never cap them, and we're coming to the end of the year, I can't just leave it on there, because if you've got a queen excluder under it, you can't leave it on for winter, because the bees need to stay where the queen is, and she won't be able to get through the excluder. So if they migrate up there, you're in a pickle. So you have to take it off for winter. And that's when we go back to what I described earlier. You're going to have to put those flow frames out to be cleaned up by the bees, and then you're going to put them in storage for winter. And then in the spring, you're going to pick your strongest colony, and just before nectar flow, you're going to put that flow super on that box. So next year. Now the question is, can you do something else to get them to use it? Well, let's just say that bees that are collecting nectar and that have a surplus will put it in glass jars, for Pete's sakes. They'll put it in Ross rounds. They'll put it in hog halves. Those are things that collect comb honey. So bees that have high production and run out of places to put stuff, start putting it everywhere, including the flow super. That's what you're counting on. Especially first time around, because it's new. It's food grade plastic that hasn't been worked by bees before, but now that it's been worked, they'll be more likely to do it. Here's another thing that I do, but you have to have several hives, and one of them has to be a flow super hive. The good news is Saskatraz bees do an extremely good job of filling flow supers even their first year as packaged bees. That's what they did here, and they filled them several times over. So another thing that I like to do, have a really risky one that I've stopped recommending, which is pull the queen excluder out, let the bees work it. Once they start to get everything set and they start storing honey in there, make sure the queen's out, put the queen excluder back in. Now they have the incentive to go up in there. Another thing you can do is you can pull that flow super off, put it on a hive that is already using a flow super. Take that hive and using a skateboard, get those bees out of it. Take that hive that's got the flow super half full of honey, put that on the hive that's having a slow start, and put the other one that's empty on the hive that was working it, and they'll continue to fill it. These will be simulated now to fill that one. If you don't have multiple colonies of bees, obviously you can't play that part. Cedar Anderson, the inventor of the flow hive, Cedar and Stuart Anderson are the ones that came up with it in Australia, New South Wales. He likes to get little bits of chunk honey, so that's honey in the comb, and smears it right on the center of the field. Because when bees fill flow supers and when they fill honey supers, they start here around the center and then they work their way outward, so it radiates out in either direction. So he takes chunk honey and rubs it right in here. I have never sprayed my flow frames with any coatings. I've never put wax on them. I've never primed them with chunks of chunk honey or anything like that. I have found that a strong colony of bees is going to put honey and wax up and propolize everything that's available to them. If they're not strong enough, if they're not big enough, if they're not populated enough, they just won't do it. So unfortunately, that's my best explanation, and those are my methods. And Saskatraz bees are fantastic. I keep 2 lines of bees. Those are the only ones that I buy. Saskatraz and Bee Weaver bees. Both are hygienic now. Doing really well. Super calm. So that's the end of it for today. I want to explain my shirt. This says the Bee Guru. Well, what's it say on your shirt, Fred, aside from the Bee Guru? It says down here, I have been to the apiary and after many seasons have returned, knowing the way to be. That's what it says. And on the back, there's a bee too. It's in my Teespring. So if you want to support me, you could go to my Teespring account, Frederick Dunn. And usually the things are underneath the videos and you can follow those things too. So that's what my shirt says. That's what I invite you to do. The other thing is, don't forget, thumbs up if you haven't done it already. You're welcome to, of course, subscribe and see what's coming up. We have cool things coming down the line. Aside from the regular question and answer videos on Fridays, we have other testing of equipment coming up, and we have some cool things to share this year. Thank you for watching. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend with your bees.